Appalachia. Everybody in the world has a reaction to that word. Makes folks think everything from beautiful mountaintop views, dangerous hillbillies running through the woods, a rifle in one hand and a jug of shine in the other, to trailer parks, drugs, and blame near everything in between. The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountains in the world. They once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretch along the eastern U.S. from Canada through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. Folks that live in these mountains have seen and endured enough things to have happened to them to make a preacher cuss. Hello, I'm Larry Bentley, and I was born and raised in the Appalachian Mountains of Southwest Virginia, and I was raised there by folks who lived for generations right there in the heart of them old mountains. Come with me and we'll take a look at some of the odd, awful, or legendary things that happen within my beloved mountains, and we'll be traveling around a little bit, looking through the eyes of an old Appalachian at some of the crazy that spread itself around outside the area as well. Welcome to Season 6 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Howdy, my good friends. I hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for stopping by. Now, in June of 1951, the Korean Peninsula was busy trying to tear itself apart, and the rest of the world had showed up to, I reckon, help do it. Warships from a half dozen nations prowled the coast like steel sharks, and among them was a Canadian destroyer called the HMCS Cayuga. On paper, well, she is a right respectable vessel, well armed, well crewed, and carrying a perfectly qualified naval surgeon. Now, that last part's where things get a little bit slippery. Now, down in the sick bay, 3 Korean soldiers lay bleeding in metal tables that were never even meant for surgery. So the ship's engines, hammered on like they always do. The deck was ready-made with a ready-made pounding headache. And the air smelled like a combination of diesel, salt, iodine, and how the hell did we get here? But soldiers crowded around the doorway, trying not to look as worried as they felt, because in the middle of it all stood the ship's doctor, a Lieutenant Joseph Sear. Now, all of that probably sounds about normal when folks are standing in the middle of a war, except for the fact that Lieutenant Joseph Sear, wasn't a doctor at all. He was Ferdinand Waldo Demara, a 6-foot-plus heavy-set kid from Massachusetts who, up until a few years prior, had been forging report cards and running away from monasteries. He'd never even seen the inside of a medical school, let alone attended one, and he'd never performed surgery. The closest thing he'd come to holding a scalpel was probably watching one on a movie theater that his uncle owned. Now, folks, this was just one of the situations that Mr. Demara found himself in the middle of his life, during his lifetime. So sit on down there and buckle in, because you ain't gonna believe this one, but I can assure you that it's a true story. Now let me tell you about a man known as the Living Light. Now back to the HMCS Cayuga. Right then, a dying man needed Dr. Sear to cut open his chest and remove a bullet lodged right next to his heart. Most folks, when faced with that situation, would panic, confess, or maybe just plain pass out from shock, or maybe make a quick jump through a porthole into the briny deep and swim for it. But Fred Demara, he did what he'd done his entire life. He bluffed every blame one of the folks within earshot. He asked for surgical textbooks. While sailors scrambled to find them, Fred washed his hands up, rolled up his sleeves, and flipped through the pages like a man cramming for the world's deadliest final exam. He skimmed diagrams, memorized steps, and muttered to himself under his breath. Now, if you'd been standing there, you might have noticed something peculiar. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't sweating. Fred had a brain like a sponge and the confidence of a man who'd never learned the meaning of the word impossible. A few minutes later, he looked up and said the words that sealed his legend. All right, let's begin. Now, I don't know about you, but if a man tells me he just learned surgery 5 minutes ago in a library book, I'm not letting him anywhere near my rib cage. But those sailors, they didn't have a choice. The real doctor was thousands of miles away in New Brunswick, Canada. probably enjoying a nice cup of tea and having no earthly idea his identity was elbow deep in another man's chest on the other side of the world. Fred made the incision. He worked real slow, carefully, and he muttered his steps under his breath while he was doing it like a recipe that his mama done taught him. He clamp, retract, suction, and by the time some miracle, when he was done, was a miracle that makes real surgeons grind their teeth because the man lived. Fred removed the bullet. He stitched the soldier up, and not only did the patient survive that, he recovered and thrived. Surgery shouldn't have worked. It defied all probability and training, and common sense on top of that. But it did work, and in doing so, it turned a con man into a war hero for about 5 minutes. Because the thing about lies is that they don't stay buried forever. Sooner or later, they float to the top like a bloated possum in a farm pond. But before we get to that part, for Fred's, carefully stacked house of cards that started to collapse, we've got to go back and look at where it all started. Back before the war, uniforms, or before stolen identities even happened. Back to a mill town in Massachusetts where the clever kid discovered that pretending to be somebody else was a whole lot more fun than being Fred DeMara. Now, Fred Ferdinand Waldo DeMara was born in December of 1921 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which back then was the kind of place where textile mills belched smoke all day, and the Merrimack River carried more industrial waste than it did fish. It wasn't hell, but it wasn't exactly Norman Rockwell painting either. Now, Fred was, as he was called, and his family wasn't poor at first. His father had steady work as a film projectionist, and his uncle owned a chain of movie theaters. Now, that meant young Fred grew up surrounded by flickering black and white images of cowboys, gangsters, and leading men who could talk a way out of anything. Now, if you're looking for where a boy might learn that identity is just another costume, you could do worse than a projection booth, I reckon. Then came the Great Depression. Now, that lovely little economic landslide, that knocked the legs out from under half the country. Fred's father lost money. The family moved to a rougher neighborhood, and suddenly the DeMaras were living a life that felt a lot smaller than it had just a few years earlier. The kids handle that sort of fallout, in different ways. Some get bitter, some get quiet, and Fred, well, he got creative. One of the earliest stories about him involves a sweet shop and a pile of chocolates. Fred convinced the shopkeeper that he had already paid, or maybe that it was his father would come by and settle up later. Now, the exact version of the lie Fred told changes a bit depending on who you ask and who tells it, but the result was the same. Fred and his friends walked out with candy they had never even intended paying for, and it was a pile of it. Now, most kids might feel guilty after something like that. Fred, well, he felt proud. He'd discovered something important. People believed what they expected to believe. If you spoke confidently and acted like you belonged, folks would hand you things just to avoid an awkward conversation. Another time, Fred found a pair of discarded artificial legs in the trash. Most kids, wouldn't run screaming, or maybe would run screaming when they seen it sticking out like that, but Fred saw an opportunity for a practical joke. Well, it was so dark that it would make a funeral director wince, but he stuck the legs upright in a snowbank by the side of the road and hid close by, waited for a passing motorist to spot and what looked like a man buried head first in a snowdrift. He laughed himself plumb sick watching grown adults go into full-blown panic mode right there in the snowbank. Now, I know some of y'all are thinking, well, that's just boys being boys. I tend to agree with you, but there's a difference between normal mischief and the kind of mind that looks at a pile of prosthetic limbs and don't see horror. He sees theater. Fred wasn't just playing, he was directing a full movie scene. To beat all that, he actually grew up devoutly religious. He read about saints and martyrs, about men who gave up everything for a higher calling. Now, maybe somewhere in that head of his, Hollywood drama and Catholic devotion all got tangled up together and short circuited something. Who knows? Or maybe he realized that he could be an actor for keeps and, didn't just want to live a life, he wanted to live a whole story. By the time he turned 16, home and school weren't cutting it for him anymore. So, like many of them restless boys before him, Fred did what the restless boys tend to do back then. He packed up his stuff and ran away. Now, Fred's destination wasn't a carnival or a big city or some romantic notion of the open road. No, this teenager was just loved him a joke about fake corpses and lying for candy. Well, he just guessed that he went to a monastery. Now, specifically, a Cistercian monastery in Central Falls, Rhode Island. Now, if you don't know much about Cistercians, I should say, I get it right, Cistercians. Imagine Catholic monks who look like other monks, and that being said, y'all are entirely too lively. We need to tone it down when they look at other monks. These men lived in near silence, prayed constantly, and worked hard enough to make a coal miner lazy. But, Fred loved it. The structure and the ritual and the sense of purpose, it all gave his chaotic mind something to latch on to. Now, for 4 years, he lived the life of a novice. Early mornings, hard labor, long hours of prayer. Now, he studied theology, physiology, and the quiet discipline of a cloistered life. But, of course, as we already expect, there was a catch. To take full vows, a monk had to stay for 5 to 6 years. Fred made it 4 before something inside him started itching again. He claimed that they suggested he might be better suited for teaching out in the world. Maybe that's true. Or maybe Fred just got bored with a life where nobody talked and nobody lied. Heck, he might have been found, might have even found another set of legs, and the monks didn't find it as funny as he did. And whatever it was, I reckon a monastery is a pretty bad place for a man that thrives on deception. Now, there's not much applause for good impersonation when somebody's wearing the same robe and answering the same name. Now, so Fred left, and with war clouds gathering over Europe and the Pacific, he did what a lot of young men did back in the late 1930s and early 40s. He enlisted in the U.S. Army. Now, the Army was a fine institution for turning civilians into fighting machines, but if I recollect correctly, it ain't particularly tolerant of free spirits who get a kick out of rewriting reality on the turn of a dime. Now, Fred, he lasted about a year before deciding military life wasn't his liking. There were just too many rules, too many people watching, and not nearly enough room for creative improvisation. So he packed up what he needed and left. Yes, folks, that was a full-blown desertion, which was a capital offense at the time. Now, I don't think it ever occurred to him that was punishable by firing squad, and here, I guess, ladies and gentlemen, is where Fred DeMara blossomed all the way into a full-blown Fred DeMara, because somewhere along the lines, it did occur to him that the offense was punishable in some way because he didn't just run away, he turned into somebody else altogether. He assumed the identity of one of his army buddies named Anthony Ignola. Now, just like that, he had a new name, new story, but the same face. That little decision, made whilst trying to avoid punishment, set the pattern for the rest of his life, because once you realize you can shed your identity like an old coat and nobody stops you, it's mighty tempting to keep trying on new ones just to see how they fit. Now, Fred, bless his chaotic little heart, was fixing to try on more of them coats than Hollywood costume department would have on hand for the movie Jeremiah Johnson. Anyway, After Fred slipped out of the Army wearing another man's name like a brand new dinner jacket, he found himself in an odd position. He was technically a criminal, morally flexible, and, most dangerously, he just discovered how easy it was to become somebody else with a little confidence and a halfway believable story. So, naturally, since he did so well in the Army, he joined the United States Navy. Now, most folks would think that deserting one branch of the military and then signing up for another under a fake name is about as subtle as robbing a bank while wearing your driver's license on your forehead. But we got to remember that it was in the early 40s during the World War. Records were paper, communication was slow, and bureaucracies were about as coordinated as three blind mules pulling in different directions. Under the name Anthony Ignola, Fred stepped on up on the naval recruiter and enlisted and was trained as a hospital corpsman, which in plain English meant that he was being trained to patch up wounded soldiers in the middle of a war zone. That there, folks, is a right noble occupation in any branch of the military, but Fred realized pretty blame quick that it was something unpleasant. A corpsman wasn't there to hand out aspirin and bandages. They were expected to run toward bullets and not away from them. Fred had many talents, but bravery under fire just, it wasn't one of them. So he tried to forge documents that would get him into the officer training school. And the logic was simple. Officers stayed further from the gunfire and got a lot better food. It was a solid plan in his mind, except for the one tiny detail that the Navy eventually noticed. That would be that the paperwork looked about as authentic as a $3 bill. Now, this time, his little forgery scheme blew up right in his face like a die pack after a bank robbery. And once again, Fred did what Fred always did in a situation when it became a bit too inconvenient. He up and disappeared. By this time, he'd honed a few key skills. He could forge documents convincingly enough to fool most people. He could mimic educated speech and mannerisms of people who are educated. And he had no emotional attachment to his own name, which made it easier to throw it away whenever it was necessary. Now that he'd ruined another good name, he needed a new identity, a fresh start, and a place where nobody would ask too many questions. So he went back to something he understood. That would be religion. Fred popped up from his hidey hole in another Cistercian monastery, this time in Louisville, Kentucky, under the name Robert Linton French. Believe it or not, I had a friend in grade school named Robert French. I don't remember. I think he was Fred DeMera, though, even though I haven't heard anything from him all this time. But now Robert French, like most of Fred's identities, was a real person, an obscure academic type who had no idea some large, fast-talking stranger was borrowing his life like a library book. Now, Fred had started redefining his method a little bit, and he'd write to institutions pretending to be the person he wanted to impersonate, requesting copies of birth certificates, academic transcripts, and other documents. People back then were, at least folks who would think anyway, was chomping at the bit to mail sensitive paperwork to anybody that asked politely and used the right letterhead. To be fair, folks just didn't do this kind of stuff too often back then, and it was a whole different world, folks. Today, we call that identity theft, and people make it their life's work. And back then, it was just called being Fred DeMera. Now, at the monastery, Fred resumed his religious life just like he'd never left. He studied, prayed, and impressed the other monks with his intelligence and apparent sincerity all over again. It might sound funny, but he wasn't faking his faith. That's one of the oddest things about him. Fred really believed in God and felt drawn to a religious life. He just happened to be in the line whenever it suited him too. But eventually, Using Robert French's credentials, he enrolled at DePaul University in Chicago to study philosophy and ethics. Now, you'd think studying ethics would, while actively impersonating somebody else, oh, well, that would create a good bit of a problem in somebody's mind and heart. But Fred seemed to handle it just fine. He excelled at his studies, and his professors flat out loved him. His classmates respected him, and he walked around living the life of a legitimate scholar. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that he made the scene dressed like Socrates on several occasions, but looking like, he was headed to a toga party or something, maybe. Now, the man had near photographic memory and an uncanny ability to absorb information fully and quickly. Now, he didn't need years of study to sound like an expert. He just needed a quiet corner, a stack of books, and a couple of days to cram. But then came the time of truth, when he was coming up to the point where he would have to take the holy orders and commit fully to the religious vocation, and do it under a stolen identity. Now, believe it or not, even Fred DeMara had limits on insulting the Almighty. Becoming a monk permanently, as Robert French, would have meant living a lifelong lie. Now, that just wasn't going to float. It wasn't going to float Fred's boat anyway, so he felt like it was a trap. So instead of confessing, apologizing, and maybe just walking away like a normal human being would, Fred did what he always did, and when he was backed into a corner, well, he just vaporized again. Next thing anybody heard of Fred was in Erie, Pennsylvania, where he was teaching psychology at a small college. Yes, folks, you heard that correctly. A man with no formal psychology degree, and very likely needed help from somebody that did, was now lecturing young folks on the workings of the human mind. His secret was about as beautiful as it was simple. He stayed one chapter ahead of his students in the textbook, and that was all there was to it. Every night he'd read the next chapter, memorize the key points, and walk into class the next morning sounding like a seasoned academic. Everybody ate it up like it was going out of style and loved every minute of it. Students learned, exams got passed, and nobody suspected a thing. Fred said he enjoyed teaching. It gave him status, routine, and admiration, which was all the things he wanted. But stability was, well, it was a little bit more than he could take. This time, when he disappeared like he'd been abducted by aliens, he landed in Los Angeles, where he worked as an orderly in a sanitarium. Now, if you ever wanted to understand just how strange mid-20th century America was, think about this. A man who'd impersonated a monk, a philosopher, a professor, and was now working as in a mental hospital surrounded by people who officially were certified insane. Now, he was doing that while he, was in a full-blown abnormal wackadoodle mode and was considered perfectly normal. Now, Fred sat back and observed everything. He learned how institutions work, how authority figures acted, and how people responded to confidence. So he was pretty much a training course, in a training course right there for him, and all of it would come in pretty handy later. Now, eventually, still using Robert French's identity, he landed another teaching job, this time at the University of Washington State, and for a while, his life was almost peaceful. He made friends, he became involved in the community, he even befriended the local sheriff, a man named Frank Tamlin. Frank liked Fred so much that he made him a special deputy. Fred gave speeches supporting the sheriff's re-election campaign, shaking hands and smiling like a man absolutely had nothing to hide. But, like we always say, lies are like unpaid credit card bills. They sit there real quiet for a spell, then one day they come due all at once. One day, Sheriff Tamlin showed up, and he wasn't there to be a friend. He was there as a full-blown law enforcement self. Now, he had a warrant for Fred's arrest. He escorted Fred down to the station. Waiting at the station were two FBI agents who'd finally connected the dots between Robert French, Anthony Ignola, and a certain missing Army deserter named Ferdinand Waldo DeMera. Now, being that the FBI don't play friends, they pounced directly on Fred and dragged him off to trial. Now, he was eventually sentenced to 18 months in the U.S. disciplinary barracks in San Pedro, California. And just like that, the world's most overqualified fake professor sat behind bars staring at the window. Now, about all that really did for him was give him time to think. Military prison ain't no spa retreat. It ain't even a character building wilderness camp. It's a place designed to make you regret your life choices through a careful blend of boredom, humiliation, and routine so strict that it'd give a Swiss watch a pucker factor. Now, Fred served out his time without major incident. He followed rules, kept his head down, spent a good bit of them months thinking about two things: how he got caught and how to fix how he got caught. Now, when he was released, he returned for a spell to his parents' house in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Now, you'd think prison would scare a man straight, convince him to settle down, get a regular job, and stop floundering around the country trying to be other people. But apparently, Fred DeMera wasn't most people. He stayed home just long enough to grow restless. The need to reinvent himself by slipping into new life like a snake shedding skin was a right smart stronger than a common sense of self-preservation. So he went out and did it again. This time he became Dr. Cecil Hammond, a biologist. Under the name Dr. Cecil Hammond, Fred managed to get him a position at Massachusetts Eye and Ear, a prestigious hospital affiliated with Harvard. Now, I had to pause here for a minute, let that fully sink in. A former deserter, serial imposter, was now working at one of the most respected medical environments in the world, in the whole blame country, and in the world, let alone anything else. And he did it the same way he'd done everything else: forged credentials, confident demeanor, and an encyclopedic memory that allowed him to speak convincingly about subjects that he'd about halfway glanced at. He took part of his salary and enrolled in night classes in law, because apparently juggling one fraudulent career wasn't fluffing his britches out far enough to suit him. Now, I reckon Fred, believed in on-the-job training, which was a lovely philosophy right up until you realize his job involved things that could kill people. Now, after a while, he got bored or maybe nervous and left Boston, heading north to Alfred, Maine, where he once again went back to religious life. This time he joined the Brothers of Christian Instruction, a teaching order that ran schools. Now, the brothers couldn't be more tickled if they had a feather shoved in their nether regions to have a man of Dr. Hammond's caliber. They welcomed him like a lost child or a long-lost friend. Now, the local newspaper even ran a story about their highly educated new member, an article that nearly destroyed Fred's carefully constructed lie when one of the real Dr. Hammond's students saw it and showed it to his professor. Now, by sheer luck, the real Dr. Hammond, now being a real true blue college professor, was way on too busy to ever report Fred as a fake. Now, that might be the most Fred DeMera thing that this entire story has to offer. Now, his survival pretty much depended less on his brilliance and more on other people being too busy to pick up the telephone. During his time with the brothers, Fred did something unusual for a con man. He actually helped them. He guided them through the complex procedure of obtaining a college charter, navigating bureaucratic red tape like a man who'd spent his entire adult life studying how the paperwork could be bent to somebody's will. Now, but when the charter was finally granted, Fred expected to be rewarded, preferably with a leadership position. Instead, he was passed over, and that's when he made a decision that would send him hurtling toward the most dangerous impersonation of his life. This time, when he left, he stole one of the brothers' cars, drove to Boston, caught a bus back to New Brunswick, Canada, and walked straight into the Navy recruiting office carrying somebody else's medical credentials. This time, he was Dr. Joseph Sear, Now, Fred DeMera was about to become a surgeon in the middle of a war. And here's where Fred's story stops being just plain ridiculous and starts turning into some kind of tale that sounds made up, even when every word of it's true. But to this point, he'd been a fake monk, fake professor, fake biologist, and a real inmate. Now he was about to become something far more dangerous, a fake surgeon in a shooting war. Now, while Fred was with the Brothers of Christian Instruction in Maine, he was sent to New Brunswick, Canada, to study theology. This was supposed to be another quiet chapter in a life that had been anything but quiet, a chance for him to deepen his religious training and maybe settle into a role he wouldn't eventually ruin this time. But Fred had that natural pull toward trouble, and in New Brunswick, trouble came in the form of a friendly local physician named Dr. Joseph Sear. Dr. Sear was the kind of man you'd trust with your children, your secrets, and apparently your entire professional identity. He was well respected, hard-working, and genuinely compassionate. Now, when one of the monks developed arthritis, Dr. Sear treated him, and during the course of them visits, he met Fred. Of course, Fred introduced himself as Dr. Cecil Hammond. Now, the biologist turned monk, well, he spoke with authority, quoted medical journals, and carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who'd spent years around laboratories and lecture halls. To Dr. Sear, he seemed like an educated colleague who'd chose a higher calling, and so they become friends. Now, friendship's a beautiful thing, but it's a terrible idea if one of them friends is Fred DeMera. Now, one day, Dr. Sear mentioned that he hoped to practice medicine in the United States someday. He asked Fred, the quiet, highly intelligent monk, to carry his credentials back with him when he returned to Maine and help him navigate the American licensing process. Fred smiled like a cat that just caught the rabbit and agreed to do just that. And that was when Dr. Joseph Sear handed his life to a con man wrapped in a robe. Fred took Dr. Sear's documents, medical degrees, transcripts, references, and instead of delivering them, he studied them. He learned the details of Dr. Sear's education and specialties and mannerisms, and within weeks he knew more about Dr. Joseph Sear's professional life than Dr. Sear did. Then Fred did what he always did. He turned into Dr. Joseph Sear. Fred returned to Maine just a little while, where he discovered the brothers had secured the college charter but hadn't chose him as the head of the institution. And that did it with him and the brothers. And Fred had helped him navigate bureaucracy after all, and he believed he deserved recognition, authority, and maybe even admiration. Instead, he got a polite thank you and a reminder of his place in the pipeline. So he left on the spot permanently, and he took one of the brothers' cars without even asking, drove to Boston, caught a bus north, and crossed back into Canada carrying Dr. Sear's credentials. Now, if you're sensing a pattern of Fred reacting poorly to getting his way, well, you're catching on faster than most institutions that hired him. In 1951, he walked into the Royal Canadian Navy recruiting office and told them that he was Dr. Joseph Sear, a licensed physician. Now, you might assume the military would carefully vet anybody claiming to be a doctor, and they did, by the standards of the time, that is. Now, but again, we got to remember this is war, and before computerized records, before instant background checks, and before databases that could tell you in 5 seconds that the man in front of you was actually a former U.S. Army deserter with a history of impersonating monks and professors. Now, Fred had genuine documents in hand. He spoke confidently and he answered questions convincingly. And so the Royal Canadian Navy did what militaries do in a time of war. They took the highly qualified volunteer and put him to work. He was commissioned as a surgeon lieutenant. Now, within months, Fred DeMera, high school dropout, serial impersonator, was wearing a naval officer's uniform and being addressed as doctor, and that just makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Fred was assigned to a Navy base in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he went about 2 months before deploying. And then something unexpected happened during that time. Well, he fell in love. Her name isn't widely recorded in history, which is probably good for her. She was a local woman who met this large, affable, intelligent Navy doctor and saw nothing but a promising future. Fred, for his part, seemed to really care for her. Now, friends, or whatever he had of them, said that that was one of the few times in his life that he actually thought he was sincerely happy. Now, they made plans to marry once his tour was over, and that there was probably one of the saddest parts of Fred's story, because for a brief time there, he was living a life that he might have worked out if he had just been honest and stayed there. But Fred's entire existence was built on Bard foundation, and Bard lives don't stand up well to stress, especially not the kind of stress that comes with shooting war in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, that is. In 1951, he boarded the Canadian destroyer HMS Cayuga and sailed for Korea. At sea, Fred performed routine medical duties. He treated minor injuries, diagnosed illness, and even handled dental work. At one point, the ship's captain needed a tooth extracted. Fred had never done dentistry before, but either that meant that he would stall and read up on the procedure and then performed it and did it exactly perfectly. Now, that was Fred in a nutshell, actually. Bluff first, study fast, and pray nobody noticed the difference. But then came that day when bluffing just wouldn't be enough. While operating off the coast of Korea, now the Cayuga received wounded Korean soldiers transferred from another ship. 3 men were brought in aboard, all serious condition. One of them had a bullet stuck close to his heart. The ship's medical facilities were basic at best. Sterilization was limited, and the operation space was cramped. And the man responsible for performing the surgery had learned his craft from a textbook and had nothing but sheer nerve. Fred later described his guiding principle during that operation as the less cutting you do, the less you have to sew up afterward. And that was pretty much it. Sounds like something you'd hear from a man repairing a torn feed sack and not conducting chest surgery. But in this case, it worked, and he made careful incisions, removed the bullet, and stitched the soldier closed. Against all reasonable expectations, the patient survived and recovered. Fred performed several other procedures during his time on board the Cayuga, and to beat it all, every one of them was successful. The crew trusted him. The officers respected him, and Fred started to believe, well, that he might actually be capable of being the man he was pretending to be. Of course, that illusion didn't last. When the Cayuga made the port in Korea, Fred went ashore and saw the conditions of the local civilians and soldiers, the overcrowded hospitals, shortages of trained doctors, and suffering on a scale like he'd never seen before. For all his dishonesty, Fred actually had a strong streak of genuine compassion. He volunteered to help the local medical clinics and hospitals, treating patients and assisting in procedures. He worked long hours under awful conditions and, by all accounts, did real good for real people. His actions impressed the locals and his fellow officers as well. A Korean military commander formerly commended him for his work, and now here's for the wheels start wobbling. The ship's radio officer, proud of his ship's doctor, decided to write up a story about Fred's heroics for official dispatches. Now, Fred tried to talk him out of it, gently at first and then more urgently. But you can't expect exactly, tell a man to stop praising you without sounding suspicious. And I guess the story was sent up the chain of command. From there, it caught the attention of journalists, and soon the newspapers started printing articles about the brave Canadian naval surgeon who had performed daring surgery at sea and treated wounded civilians in a war. And back in New Brunswick, the real Dr. Joseph Sear was flipping through newspapers when he saw his own name staring back at him from the page, and he knew that something was real wrong with that. Dr. Sear contacted authorities, who in turn contacted the Royal Canadian Navy and the captain of the Cayuga. Now, the man who respected and trusted his doctor initially believed that there had to be some kind of a bureaucratic mess up. After all, the man he knew as Dr. Sear had saved lives, worked tirelessly, and behaved like a model officer. But facts have a way of ruining good impressions. Investigations confirmed the truth, and the ship's surgeon was not Joseph Sear. He was Ferdinand Waldo Demara, American citizen, former deserter, and serial impersonator. Fred was quietly removed from his post and sent back to Canada. There was no dramatic pounce on and arrest at sea, no handcuffs in front of, no frog marching and on the deck, and just a silent understanding that this time, as Dr. Sear, well, it's over. Oddly enough, the crew pretty much wouldn't condemn him. They'd seen him work and watched him save lives. To them, he wasn't just a fraud. Well, he was a man who kept them alive and healthy in a war zone. He was deported back to the United States rather than prosecuted in Canada. Now, the authorities preferred to avoid the embarrassment of admitting they let a fake doctor operate in their Navy. Fred went back to Lawrence, Massachusetts, where his parents, by now thoroughly exhausted with their sons carrying on, once again opened the door to him. Not long after, a journalist from Life magazine came calling. Fred, needing money and having a craving for the spotlight, agreed to an interview. Now, the resulting article turned him into a national sensation. The Great Imposter was what it was called. And in a move that would come back to haunt him, he posed for photographs, smiling and relaxed, his face now permanently tied to one of the most bizarre fraud stories in the 20th century. Now, by the time the issue hit newsstand, Fred had already disappeared again. Because no matter how famous he was, Fred Demara only knew one way to live, and that was on the run, wearing somebody else's name like a coat. Now, the Life magazine article did something unusual. It didn't just expose Fred, it made him a celebrity. And America in the 1950s had a strange fondness for charming rogues. Now, especially ones who hadn't robbed banks or killed anybody. Fred had impersonated doctors, monks, and professors, and he'd also saved lives and spoke eloquently about morality and faith. Now, he was a criminal who sounded like a philosopher and behaved like a benevolent uncle. People were fascinated, and Fred was plumb mortified. And for years, his greatest fear hadn't been prison or punishment, it had been being known. Now, being exposed meant people, they'd look at him not as a respected professional, but as a fraud, a joke, or a punchline. And now his photograph was on the magazines across the country, smiling back at grocery store customers like they bought canned peaches and cigarettes. And then he started drinking more heavily. He drifted from job to job, sometimes using aliases to avoid recognition, sometimes trying to work under his real name, and discovering that once you've been publicly revealed as a world-class liar, employers get a little bit skittish about handing you a responsibility of any kind. Eventually, he headed out to Texas, Houston, Texas to be exact, because nothing says a fresh start like a 1,500-mile distance and a whole new accent to confuse people. In 1955, Fred resurfaced as Dr. Benjamin Jones, a professor from Mississippi. And if you're thinking surely by now people were checking references more carefully, well, you're giving the 1950s bureaucracy way too much credit. Fred applied for a position with the Texas Department of Corrections. Instead of submitting his application through normal channels, he deliberately sent it to the wrong department head, knowing that the official would forward it to the correct person. Now, this made it look like somebody important had already reviewed and approved his paperwork. Now, that little psychological trick gave him instant credibility. Now, when asked for 8 character references, Fred wrote them all himself. And he even engineered a scheme involving stamps, or stamped envelopes, and out-of-state postmarks to make the letters look authentic. It was less resume building and more stage magic. And the letterhead, and it worked. He was hired as a lieutenant of the guard at one of the Texas's most notorious prison farms. Now, if you've never read about Southern prison farms in the 1950s, let me paint you a picture. Imagine chain gangs working under Texas sun, guards on horseback with shotguns, and a system that treated inmates like a combination of cheap labor and disposable bodies. Now, it was brutal, racist, and about as rehabilitative as a kick in the teeth. Fred was horrified. This is one of the strangest contradictions in his life. The man had no problem lying about being a doctor, but he couldn't stomach watching guards beat prisoners. Now, he transferred out of the security work and into the prison's reaction department, or recreation department. That's where he could at least pretend that he was helping people instead of supervising their misery. His intelligence and calm demeanor impressed his superiors, and before long he was promoted again, this time to, we wouldn't believe it, deputy warden of a new high-security facility named Shamrock. That's right, folks. The former fake monk, fake surgeon, and fake professor was now second in command of a maximum security prison full of violent offenders. His deputy warden, or as deputy warden, Fred introduced surprisingly progressive ideas. He believed that prisoners responded better to structure and respect and the beatings instead of beatings and humiliation. Now, he pushed for educational programs, recreation activities, and psychological evaluations. Those concepts that was revolutionary in the Texas prison system at the time. He even secretly administered tranquilizers to particularly volatile inmates and to keep them calm. Now, ethically speaking, that's questionable at best, but compared to the guards cracking skulls with batons, it looked more humane than that. Fred later joked that Shamrock was Texas' first hospital for the criminally insane, and in his own warped way, he was proud of the work he'd done there. The tragic irony was that this might have been one of the few roles that Fred was genuinely good at, and, he understood human behavior, and he had no fear of criminals, and he had a gift for talking people down from violent outbursts. But if he'd had real credentials, he might have built a respectable career in the corrections psychology level. But lies have a, half-life, and they decay slowly but inevitably. And Fred's downfall came not from an investigator or a supervisor or a background check, but from a prisoner with a good memory and too much time to read old magazines. One day, an inmate stared at Fred just a little bit too long, and he said something along the lines of, you ain't that fake doctor from that magazine, are you? No, that's about all it took right there. Fred denied it. Of course, he always denied it, but suspicion had been planted, and once people start looking at your story, cracks appear everywhere. Now, his superiors confronted him. Fred maintained his innocence, but he also knew the jig was up. Now, as soon as he was out of their sight, he did what he did, and God heaven only knows how many times before, and he packed up his belongings, got in his car, and vanished into the night like a ghost with a driver's license. Now, by the summer of 1956, Fred stepped off a ferry in North Haven Island, which is a small, tight-knit community of the coast of Maine. Now, this time he was Martin Godgert. Now, the new school teacher. Now, if you ever lived in a small town or even visited one long enough to notice how quickly strangers get cataloged and discussed, you'll know that this was a risky move. On an island, everybody knows everybody's business, their grandparents' business, and what kind of toothpaste they even used. Fred taught English and Latin, subjects that suited his love of language and memory. He threw himself into the community life, attending events, chatting it up with parents, and generally behaving like a man who had nothing to hide. Now, for a while, it worked. Locals warmed up to him, children liked him. Now, he was, by most accounts, a good teacher, but Fred's cheese whiz was starting to slide off his cracker. Years of running, lying, and being exposed, had wore him down. He started drinking again, and alcohol was a new way of losing both tongues or loosing both tongues and judgment. Now, he made a few indiscreet comments, little slips that hinted at a past that, didn't quite match the story he told everybody. Now, one of the mothers on the island got suspicious, and instead of confronting him directly, she did something, clever and terrifying and methodical. Well, she ordered an old Life magazine, and when it got there, she saw Fred's face staring back at her from the article about the great imposter. Now, she didn't call the police right away. Well, no, she did something even more impressive. She invited him over for a drink, got him talking, and made sure he left his fingerprints on the glass, and then she sent the glass to the FBI. The woman would, she would have made a fine detective or a terrifying mother-in-law, one or the other. On February 14th, 1957, agents arrived on the island, pounced on and arrested Fred. He was taken away by boat, once again leaving behind a group of people who had trusted him and felt betrayed. Once again, the legal consequences, they were pretty mild, believe it or not. He would give 2 months of probation for teaching without a proper license, because apparently being a notorious international fake wad wasn't, really illegal if you wasn't committing a whole big bunch of crime while doing it. Good thing he wasn't around today, or police would have been on him like ugly on a heap. But by the late 1950s, Fred's story done got too far out there and just made newspapers, and a writer, Bill Crichton, spent time with him and turned his life into a biography titled The Great Imposter, and it got published in 1959. The book was a bestseller. Fred had once upon a time been scared to death of any kind of exposure, and now the position of being famous for his lies, people invited him to speak. Hollywood came calling, and he was no longer a con man. He was a curiosity, a living oddity, and a decade that, loved anything unusual as long as it wasn't threatening. 1960, he even appeared on a small role in a horror film called The Hypnotic Eye, playing, a surgeon. Now, he later said acting in movies felt fake compared to real life. Impersonations, real life impersonations, which is one of the most unintentional, hilarious sentences ever uttered by a man who had pretended for over a dozen people for God knows how many years. He made an appearance on the Groucho Marx television show, You Bet Your Life, where he joked about how he'd acquired all his credentials. The audience laughed, Groucho laughed, Fred laughed, heck, the whole country's laughing too. That was the good news. Bad news was that Fred was a man that done burned every bridge he'd ever crossed, and folks, left them in smoke. In 1961, Hollywood released the film of Crichton's book, The Great Imposter, and it starred Tony Curtis as Fred. Fred wasn't impressed with it. He walked around complaining that Curtis didn't look nothing like him. Of course, that was true, but if I was Fred, I wouldn't complain about somebody looked a whole sight better than I did playing me in a movie. Now, by that time, Fred had gained significant weight, and years of stress and drinking were catching up to him. By the mid-1960s, his health was deteriorating. The life of constant lies was just too much for him to keep going, and he was tired, sick, and running out of places to run. For the first time in his life, Fred decided to do something radical. At least for him, he was going to live honestly. Apparently, it takes a right smart bit of energy to fake a life down to a T, and he just didn't have the drive to do it anymore. So he enrolled in a Bible college in Oregon and actually earned a legitimate degree, the first credential he had ever possessed. He must have made his hat fall in the creek to think about the fact that after decades of faking qualifications, he finally went through the proper channels to earn one. With his degree, he got a position as hospital chaplain in Anaheim, California, and by all accounts, he was good at it. He comforted patients, counseled families, and provided spiritual guidance with a genuine compassion. Now, when his past eventually surfaced, the hospital considered firing him, but this time, his credentials were real, his work was honest,
and the chief of staff was, well, they chose to keep him. I don't know what it took for people back then to notice him or what he did, but being that he'd been all over television and movies, but for some reason, folks in Anaheim were, I guess, living in a cave and they didn't notice him. Fred thought that it was the only time in his life when being his actual self turned out better than pretending to be somebody else. How he thought what he'd been through, walking around looking over his shoulder and sleeping with one eye open, was a good on any level. Well, it makes me wonder about the man's sanity. By the late 1960s, Fred DeMera had lived more lives than an old barn cat. Now, he'd been a monk, a soldier, a deserter, a professor, a prison official, a school teacher, a naval surgeon, a Hollywood extra, and finally a man with an honest diploma hanging on his wall. Now, he was worked at that job as a chaplain in Anaheim, wearing a simple clerical collar instead of a barred uniform. And for the first time since he'd been a teenager, he wasn't hiding behind a fake name. Now, you'd think that would feel like freedom. But to Fred, it felt more like surrender. He was older than his years, his body heavy and tired, his health steadily sliding downhill thanks to diabetes, poor diet, and decades of high stress. Now, the wild energy that used to carry him across borders and through institutions, well, it just burned itself plumb out like firework display. Spectacular, well, I guess, while it lasted, but leaving nothing but smoke in the wind. Still, he did a good job. Patients liked him, and he had a general way of speaking and a knack for telling people what they needed to hear without sounding like he was reading from a pamphlet. He hardly ever talked about his past unless he was asked, and even then he acted like the whole thing happened to somebody else. I reckon in a way, maybe it did. Fred had been so many different people that his real identity had got lost in the shuffle somewhere around the Korean War. Now, he sure wasn't the same feller now, that he was then. Fred remained in that role for years, providing comfort for people in their worst moments, families grieving in the hallways, patients facing terminal diagnosis, lonely elderly people who just needed somebody to sit down and listen while machines beeped in the background. By 1980, Fred's health had deteriorated to the point where he really just couldn't work anymore. Now, diabetes had done what prisons and the FBI and international embarrassment never managed to do. It finally forced him to stop. Now, he moved from chaplain to patient, occupying the same kind of hospital bed he'd stood beside for so many years. Now, stories floated around, including the persistent rumor that he had actually gave Steve McQueen his last rites. It's a nice story, but timelines don't quite match up. Steve McQueen died in Mexico, and Fred was, already too ill to travel. Probably just one of them legends that grow around a man whose life already sounds like fiction. Now, on June 7th, 1982, Fred died at the age of 60 from complications related to diabetes and heart failure. Now, 60 ain't old by today's standards, but Fred had lived hard, eat horribly, and carried stress like a permanent backpack full of bricks. He was buried without not much fanfare, no military honors, no academic tributes, just a man in a casket, leaving behind a paper trail of aliases and a handful of people that remembered him as either a friend, a fraud, or something in between. So what do you make of a man like Ferdinand Waldo DeMera? He wasn't a typical criminal. He didn't rob banks, run scams, or people's finances. He didn't seem driven by greed or by anything else. No, he just forged a new identity every time he needed one. He had a photographic memory, and he'd possessed a little more patience. He might have been a legitimate doctor, professor, or an administrator, a real one. Now he proved that he had talent. He just, didn't have the discipline to build a life slowly the way most people did, brick by brick. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Fred had simply stayed, Fred from the start. But that, my good friends, is a story you just can't make up. But I hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast. If you watching on YouTube, Rumble, or Spotify, please throw us a like. Don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you watch or listen. Come on over to Appalachian Murder Mystery Legend Podcast Group on Facebook for the We Talk Appalachian or anything else you might want to talk about. And I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian murder mystery or legend. I'll see you then.